4 minutes before my ex-husband's carefully curated reality shattered, he was practically holding court in the Marine Biology Institute's East Wing. He gripped a bright green toddler leash in one hand and openly bragged to an intern about how dumping me saved his life. I noted the time, exactly 10:17 on a dismal Thursday morning. I know this because my eyes flicked to the digital terminal above the saltwater tanks the second I realized I was staring straight at Jarek Thorne for the first time in 13 months. They say time patches up the rough spots. I'm not entirely sold on that. What I actually learned is that a year out from a brutal divorce, your brain stops bracing for impact. You absolutely do not anticipate running into your ex while hauling a waterproof binder full of acoustic telemetry data, rushing to a grant committee review. You definitely don't expect to see him standing hip to hip with your former confidant, Vialia, and you certainly don't expect her to be rocking a baby carrier. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second, not out of residual affection. That particular fire burned out long ago. It was more about muscle memory. A healed bone still throbs when the air pressure drops. Outside, coastal fog choked the harbor. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the observation deck. Maybe the miserable weather amplified the shock. Or maybe staring at the two people who systematically dismantled your domestic life simply never gets comfortable. Nemyra, one of the junior researchers, slowed down, eyeing me. You good? Fine. I shifted the heavy binder against my hip, just spacing out. She gave a quick nod and vanished down the hall. I genuinely considered just walking past them, keeping my head down, pretending I was absorbed in the sonar charts. But Jarek caught my movement. His features immediately shifted into a massive grin. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look awkward. He looked entertained. It was the identical, arrogant smirk I had stared at across countless kitchen tables. Well, well, he projected his voice so the tourists near the touch tanks would turn. Echoey aquarium halls are awful for privacy. Valia glanced up from adjusting the baby's knitted cap. Her smile was incredibly tight, barely stretching her cheeks. At least somebody had the decency to feel embarrassed. I thought about making a break for the stairs, but a decade and a half in high-stakes research taught me one hard rule. Avoiding a mess usually just makes it spread. So I planted my feet. Hello, Jarek. He crossed his arms, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Nemyra. The kid strapped to Valia's chest swatted at a dangling plastic seahorse. Dark hair, light eyes, looked to be about a year old. Valia fussed with the baby's collar. The whole routine felt wildly staged, like she desperately needed the random strangers nearby to witness her flawless domestic bliss. Nobody said a word for a long, heavy beat. Jarek finally popped the tension. How's life treating you? Still practically sleeping in the lab? The words were casual, but the edge was razor sharp. I'm managing just fine, I said. I bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from rolling my eyes. There it was, his favorite grievance. Every argument we ever had eventually dragged my career into the mud. Too many deep-sea expeditions, too many late nights analyzing frequency data, too much ambition. He conveniently ignored his own 80-hour weeks at the hedge fund. The standard was just different for me. I like what I do, I added. Oh, everybody knows that. A nearby couple paused their conversation, glancing over. They could read the hostility bleeding into the air. Jarek took a half step forward. Nice to see you haven't changed. Valia shifted her weight, clearly miserable. Jarek, come on. He ignored her completely. What, we're all grown-ups? I recognized the posture. He was on stage, and he desperately wanted the crowd to pay attention. Then he dropped the hammer, the exact sentence he likely rehearsed in the shower for a year. Leaving you was the smartest move I've ever made. The background noise of bubbling tanks and distant chatter seemed to evaporate. Valia found a sudden intense interest in her shoes. I kept my face entirely blank. I was furious, absolutely, but lead scientists learn to bury panic fast. You don't lose your cool when a dive goes wrong, and eventually that ice in your veins bleeds into your personal life. He wasn't done. A hollow woman can't build a home. There was the kill shot, the one he knew would draw blood. We had spent 6 years trying to start a family, 6 years of invasive treatments, negative tests, quiet weeping in clinic parking garages, and dead silence on the drive home. I genuinely thought we were in the trenches together back then. I was an idiot. Valia grabbed his elbow. "Stop it." He laughed, gesturing to the carrier. "I'm a lucky guy. I got a son with your closest friend." Those words just hung there in the damp air, vicious, calculated, meant to shatter me on the spot. The bizarre part, I braced for the collapse, but it never came. I just felt exhausted, bone-deep tired. Maybe my grief had burnt itself out months ago. Maybe getting stabbed in the back hurts less when the knife has been sitting there for a year. Or maybe it was because I knew a few things he didn't. I glanced down at the baby. It wasn't the kid's fault his parents were toxic. I shifted my gaze to Violia. She flat out refused to look at me. People who are genuinely thrilled with their life choices usually don't stare at the linoleum like it holds the secrets of the universe. Finally, I met Jarek's eyes. He was vibrating with anticipation, waiting for the tears. Instead, I let a slow, faint smirk touch my face. "Is that right?" I asked quietly. His smugness cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but I caught it. What the hell does that mean? Nothing. Just intriguing. Now he just looked pissed. Good. He hated losing control of the narrative. Suddenly, my phone vibrated hard against my ribs. I pulled it from my jacket. The sender's name made my stomach drop.
Ronan Kale. I hadn't heard a word from him since the winter symposium. I definitely didn't expect him to reach out today, of all days. I swiped open the notification. The text was brutally short. "I'm in the main atrium. Get down here now." My heart kicked up a notch. Not out of panic, but sheer shock. Ronan was notoriously elusive. He didn't send dramatic texts unless the building was on fire or our entire grant funding was getting yanked. Suddenly, this dreary Thursday felt like it was shifting off its axis. I shoved the device back into my pocket. Jarek was still glaring at me, trying to dissect my lack of a breakdown. For a split second, looking at his confused, angry face, I actually pitied him. Just a little. "I have to go," I said, turning my back on them. I could practically feel his glare burning a hole through my jacket as I walked away. He absolutely loathed it when people walked out on his lectures. During our marriage, he used to shadow me from the kitchen to the bedroom just to guarantee he got the final word. I hit the call button for the grass elevator. The doors chimed and slid open instantly. Part 7. Before I could step inside, Jarek's voice echoed down the hall, loud enough to turn a few more heads by the stingray exhibits. "Still running away when things get too real, Nemyra?" I paused, my hand resting on the cool metal frame of the elevator. I gripped the edges of my data binder and slowly looked over my shoulder. Standing there with his new family, trying so hard to project absolute dominance, he just looked desperately small. He was clinging to a narrative that I didn't care about anymore. "No, Jarek," I said, my voice steady. It wasn't a shout. It was quiet enough that he actually had to strain to hear it over the ambient noise. "I'm just finally heading towards something that actually matters." I stepped into the cab and hit the button for the ground floor. Valia was still staring at the floor, and Jarek's mouth was slightly open in a silent protest. I didn't stick around to watch him try to formulate a comeback. The heavy glass doors glided shut, seamlessly cutting off his face and the dreary echo of the observation deck entirely. The quiet mechanical hum of the elevator surrounded me as I began my descent toward the main atrium. Whatever Ronan was waiting down there to tell me, It was already miles better than dealing with the ghosts of my past.
Before I could step inside, Jarek's voice echoed down the hall, loud enough to turn a few more heads by the stingray exhibits. "Still running away when things get too real, Nemyra?" I paused, my hand resting on the cool metal frame of the elevator. I gripped the edges of my data binder and slowly looked over my shoulder. Standing there with his new family, trying so hard to project absolute dominance, he just looked desperately small. He was clinging to a narrative that I didn't care about anymore. "No, Jarek," I said, my voice steady. It wasn't a shout. It was quiet enough that he actually had to strain to hear it over the ambient noise. "I'm just finally heading towards something that actually matters." I stepped into the cab and hit the button for the ground floor. Valea was still staring at the floor, and Jarek's mouth was slightly open in a silent protest. I didn't stick around to watch him try to formulate a comeback. The heavy glass doors glided shut, seamlessly cutting off his face and the dreary echo of the observation deck entirely. The quiet mechanical hum of the elevator surrounded me as I began my descent toward the main atrium. Whatever Ronan was waiting down there to tell me, it was already miles better than dealing with the ghosts of my past. Outside the soaring glass walls of the Marine Biology Institute's main atrium, a vicious coastal storm battered the harbor. Interns and faculty scrambled across the slick concrete, fighting wind-blown umbrellas. Ronan Kale waited near the espresso kiosk. Even from 50 feet away, the man radiated absolute gravity. That alone spiked my adrenaline. Ronan absolutely despised theatricality. Nearing 60, he had clawed his way to the top of the regional legal food chain. When you needed a standard contract enforced, you hired a regular lawyer. When your life turned into a radioactive hazard zone, you called Ronan. I approached the high-top table, and he immediately stood up. "Nemyra." We skipped the pleasantries. "Your text gave me a mild heart attack," I said, pulling out a metal stool. He scanned the bustling atrium. "Let's grab that booth in the back." Nobody ever says that when bringing good news. We settled into a vinyl booth that smelled faintly of roasted beans and industrial floor cleaner. The daily chaos of the research facility hummed around us, interns arguing over tank salinity, phones buzzing, boots squeaking on wet tiles. It was my sanctuary. Ronan dropped a thick manila envelope on the table. I dug up something. My throat went completely dry. Define something. The kind that fundamentally rewrites the last 18 months of your life. I leaned against the hard vinyl. A year ago, Ronan had dragged my divorce settlement across the finish line. I genuinely thought the ink was dry on that nightmare. I was incredibly, stupidly wrong. Ronan fanned out a stack of heavily redacted printouts. "Read these." I skimmed the first page, then the second. By the third, my brain simply refused to process the digits. "Ronan, this is garbage data. This can't be accurate." "It's meticulously accurate," he replied quietly. I just stared. Offshore routing numbers, blind trusts, undeclared equity in holding companies. It was an avalanche of capital that flat out did not exist during our brutal mediation sessions. "Give me a number," I demanded. Ronan ran a hand over his jaw. "From what my forensic guy untangled so far, roughly 850,000. I physically recoiled. 850,000. Not a rounding error, not a secret rainy day fund. A fortune he had deliberately buried while I was liquidating my retirement to pay for the house. My initial reaction wasn't outrage. It was pure, unfiltered bewilderment. Jarek was the guy who regularly forgot his own network passwords. He once locked his keys inside a running car twice in the same weekend. Yet he engineered a financial black site? How did he even pull this off?
I asked. Ronan let out a dry, humorless breath. That's the punchline. Criminals getting sloppy? Jarek submitted a massive loan application for a commercial waterfront property last month. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a bitter laugh. Of course he did. Jarek practically fed on status. Real players own commercial real estate, so Jarek needed a piece of the skyline. The problem with paper trails, Ronan continued, is that banks want to see total liquidity.
To secure the massive waterfront loan, Jarek had eagerly handed the bank proof of the exact wealth he'd sworn under oath didn't exist. He'd nuked his own cover-up just to buy a building. For the first time in an hour, a genuine laugh tore out of my throat. It wasn't triumph, it was just the sheer, terrifying absurdity of it all. After systematically destroying my mental health, he tripped over his own rampant ego. Ronan cracked a half smile. I'm glad one of us is laughing. I spent an hour screaming at a paralegal this morning. I wiped my eyes, dropping my voice as a group of undergraduates walked past. So what's the play? We dig deeper. Once the forensic audit is airtight, I drag him back into civil court. I let out a long breath, tracing the edge of the table. Reopening this meant letting the toxicity back into my life. I had spent 12 months clawing my way out of that dark hole, focusing entirely on my deep-sea acoustics research. Now the ghost of my marriage was kicking the door down again. Ronan shifted his weight. There's a secondary issue. I looked up, instantly catching the shift in his tone. The lawyer was gone. He sounded almost hesitant. What kind of issue? Nemyra, when you and Jarek were trying for a child, he stopped. My lungs felt instantly tight. Even a year later, that topic felt like walking on broken glass. What about it? Did he ever actually finish his side of the clinical evaluations? The question hit me like a physical blow. A dozen miserable memories rushed back, sitting in sterile clinic waiting rooms alone, Jarek suddenly having emergency board meetings, unavoidable business trips, phantom scheduling conflicts that always conveniently arose right before his diagnostic labs. At the time, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I desperately wanted to believe we were a team. No, I whispered, the word tasting like ash. He always bailed right before the final panels. Ronan tapped his knuckles against the manila folder. He looked grim. I figured. While my guy was digging through his insurance records for hidden assets, he tripped over a stray medical disclosure. Ice flooded my veins. As a senior researcher, patient privacy is sacred to me. I've spent my life guarding data. Ronan read my face immediately. I didn't illegally pull his medical files, but he carelessly attached a summary page to an old insurance dispute. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh murmur. The summary heavily indicates he had a concrete diagnosis years ago. Nobody spoke. The espresso machine hissed violently in the background, but my mind was utterly silent, furiously stringing together a horrifying sequence of events. Are you telling me he knew? The tremor in my voice was uncontrollable. I'm telling you, there is hard evidence he knew exactly where the roadblock was, and he let you take the fall. My heart slammed against my ribs, not because I had the documents in my hand, but because 5 years of agonizing self-hatred suddenly shattered. The nights I spent sobbing on the bathroom floor, the endless apologies I offered him. He watched me break my own heart year after year, knowing his biology was the dead end. Outside, the coastal squall hammered the atrium glass. Inside, a cold, terrifying clarity began to take root. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. Just as I reached for the folder, my phone buzzed. A social alert. Valia had just pushed a new post to her feed. I opened the image. It was a candid shot of Valia sitting on a picnic blanket at the marina. The caption read, "Perfect afternoon with my perfect boy." I wasn't looking at Valia. I was looking at the kid in her lap. His size, his motor skills. He looked closer to 14 months old. The math violently snapped into place, revealing a timeline that proved they were sleeping together long before the divorce was even a conversation. "What is it?" Ronan asked. I locked the screen. Nothing I want to say out loud yet. Science teaches you to verify the data before screaming the conclusion. Ronan stood up. I'm heading back to the firm. Watch your back, Nemyra. Cornered liars are dangerous. He wasn't wrong. By 6 o'clock, I was driving through the rain-slicked city streets. Normally, the radio kept me company. Tonight, I drove in absolute deafening silence. The drive back to my condo that evening was completely silent. I left the radio off. My brain just kept churning through the same agonizing loop of questions. What exactly had Jarek known? How many years had he known it? And why did Velia look like she was constantly waiting for the floor to cave in? By the time I pulled into my driveway, my head was pounding, and I had absolutely zero answers. The following month was pure grinding frustration. Ronan's forensic investigation moved at a glacial pace. Subpoenas, financial audits, sworn depositions. The legal system does not care about your need for closure. Real life never moves at the speed of a thriller. Meanwhile, Jarek went on the offensive online. He acted aggressively normal. My social feeds were constantly polluted with his carefully curated posts, weekend getaways to the coast, elaborate birthday dinners, endless candid shots of the baby playing on expensive rugs. It was a relentless campaign to project the image of the flawless family man he desperately wanted the world to see. Watching it, I honestly wondered if he had successfully brainwashed himself into believing his own fiction. Then, everything fractured. On a suffocatingly humid Thursday afternoon in late April, my phone rang. I nearly dropped my coffee when I looked at the screen. Velia. She hadn't reached out to me directly in over a year, not during the divorce, not when she moved her boxes into his house, and certainly not after engineering the most humiliating betrayal of my adult life. Yet her name was glowing right there. I stared at the screen until the final rang, then hit accept. Hello? Total silence on the other end, just ragged, uneven breathing, the kind of breathing someone does when they are desperately trying not to hyperventilate. Nemyra, she finally whispered. I instantly knew she was in deep trouble. Velia always talked at lightning speed when she was just regular anxious. Right now, she sounded like someone bracing for a fatal impact. What do you want? I kept my voice flat. A long, painful pause. Can we just meet? Every survival instinct in my body screamed to hang up. I probably should have, but morbid curiosity is a powerful drug. When? I asked. Today. More heavy silence. Then her voice cracked entirely. I need to ask you something important. That vague evasion only spiked my suspicions further, but I agreed to meet her at an independent coffee roaster near the university campus. An hour later, I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the cafe. Velia was already huddled at a corner table. She looked utterly wrecked. I don't mean physically unkempt. She still wore her expensive clothes, but emotionally hollowed out. As a field researcher, I spend my life observing stress responses in organisms. The woman sitting across from me was functioning in pure survival mode. She stood up awkwardly as I approached. Thanks for showing up, she mumbled. I slid into the wooden chair opposite her. Start talking. Velia flinched. She kept throwing paranoid glances over her shoulder at the barista station, then leaned across the table, dropping her voice to a harsh whisper. Have you heard anything going on with Jarek lately? There it was. No groveling, no tearful apologies for destroying my life, just raw, unfiltered panic about her own situation. What exactly am I supposed to be hearing? I asked, not giving her an inch. Her knuckles turned white around her paper cup. He's been acting erratic, angry. I just stared at her, waiting. He keeps taking phone calls out in the garage, and if I even casually ask who called, he completely snaps at me. She stopped, her jaw trembling slightly. I studied her face under the harsh cafe lighting. The realization hit me like cold water. Velia was miserable. The aggressively perfect Instagram photos were a screen smoke. Sitting right here, Inches away, she looked cornered and deeply terrified of the man she had stolen. "Valia," I said, my tone softening just a fraction despite the anger boiling in my chest. "What are you not telling me?" She swallowed hard, looking down at the scarred wooden table. When she finally spoke, her voice was so frail I almost couldn't hear over the espresso grinder. "I found some paperwork." My pulse spiked instantly. "What kind of paperwork?" "I don't know," she lied quickly.
"That's a lie," I shot back. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Medical records. Old ones." The pieces began slamming together in my head. Now I knew exactly why she had called. She wasn't seeking absolution. She was hunting for clues, desperately hoping I held the missing pieces to a puzzle that was currently tearing her reality apart. Unfortunately for her, I was just as in the dark, though the light was creeping in fast. What did the records say? "I don't know," her voice broke, and this time she sounded genuinely desperate. I've never seen him scream like that. Neither of us spoke for a long minute. The cafe noise washed over us. Then she finally asked the question that had been eating her alive. "Nemyra," she looked up, her eyes wet. "Did he ever lie to you?" The sheer audacity of the question almost made me laugh out loud. It wasn't funny, it was just staggeringly absurd. This woman had orchestrated the collapse of my marriage, and now she was begging me to verify the character of the man she had cheated with. The universe has an incredibly twisted sense of humor. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "Valia, that is a question you are going to have to answer for yourself." She looked devastated, but I wasn't her therapist anymore. As I shoved my hands into my coat pockets and walked toward the exit, she called out, "Nemyra." I stopped without turning around. "What?" "I think something is fundamentally wrong." Her voice was completely drained of hope. I looked back at her pale, frightened face for a long second. "Yeah," I said, quietly. "So do I." 3 days later, Ronan called my office. What he told me in that 5-minute conversation didn't just confirm my dark suspicions, it entirely obliterated them. The actual truth was infinitely more bizarre than anything my imagination had cooked up. I was sitting at my lab computer, crunching acoustic frequencies when my phone rang. "You need to sit down," Ronan said the second I answered. "No greeting." "I am sitting." "Good." The line went completely quiet. Even the background noise of his law firm was gone. "The financial audit is locked in," Ronan finally said. "We have undeniable proof Jarek buried massive offshore assets during your divorce." I closed my eyes. I knew it was coming, but hearing the confirmation felt heavy, permanent. "You sound tense, Ronan. What else?" I heard a heavy file drop on his mahogany desk. "Are you alone in the lab?" "Yes." Another pause. "The old medical records we found, they just intersected with a brand new active legal filing." My stomach plummeted. "What kind of filing?" "A paternity dispute." I stopped breathing. The hum of the lab servers suddenly sounded deafening. "A what?" Ronan repeated, his voice low and dead serious. I stood up, nearly knocking my chair backward, and walked to the reinforced window overlooking the research harbor. The ocean looked incredibly calm today, boats bobbing gently against the docks, normal life happening out there. Inside my office, reality was tearing at the seams. "Ronan, explain exactly what you mean." "The kid, Nemyra, the child isn't Yarek's biological son." I couldn't form a single word. My brain simply refused to compute the data. It wasn't that it was impossible, it was just so violently unexpected. For 13 months, I had tortured myself with the narrative that Jarek had finally secured the perfect family he swore my body denied him. Now that entire foundation was dust. "Does Valia know?" I asked. "Does Valia know?" "She's about to." "Are you absolutely certain about this?" "I'm as certain as a legal being can be before a judge bangs a gavel." I slowly sank back into my chair.
For a year, I had dreamed up 100 different ways karma might catch up to him. None of them looked like this. None of them involved Jarek getting utterly ruined by his own deceit. It felt terrifyingly poetic. The man who destroyed my life because I couldn't give him a child was raising a stranger's baby.
What happens now? I asked the phone. Ronan sighed heavily. Now, the explosion goes public. He was entirely correct. 2 weeks later, the blast radius hit the city. The catalyst wasn't some dramatic screaming match. It was just a standard court summons. People think scandals arrive like storms, but they usually arrive as a stack of printed paper. By that Friday morning, Jarek was frantically calling every mutual contact we had. Colleagues, college friends, investors. By Friday afternoon, everyone was sending his calls straight to voicemail. The rumors bled through the city fast, and the court dockets moved faster. Then came the hearing. Downtown Civil Courthouse, room 412. The gallery was packed, shoulder to shoulder. Turns out, high society implosions draw an audience. I got there 30 minutes early. Scientific fieldwork teaches you never to be late for a critical event. Ronan was already seated, intensely organized. 3 thick binders, a yellow legal pad, and cold coffee. "You ready for this?" he asked without looking up. "No." "Good," he muttered. "Anyone who enjoys this kind of bloodbath needs therapy." At 9 sharp, Jarek walked through the heavy oak doors. He looked completely shattered. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified stare. Valeria walked 3 paces behind him, looking like a ghost. I didn't feel smug. I just felt a heavy, dark ache in my chest. Then, the judge called the room to order.
The proceedings moved with brutal efficiency. The financial fraud hit the floor first. Bank statements, hidden equity, wire transfers, every single document Ronan presented systematically dismantled the fake reality Jarek had built. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. The judge opened the file containing the medical disclosures. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You couldn't even hear a chair squeak. The evidence plainly showed that 5 years ago, while we were still married, Jarek received a definitive diagnosis of severe, irreversible infertility. He knew. He took the medical panel results, hid them in a private safe, and watched me slowly destroy my mental health, thinking I was the broken one. He let me endure the invasive tests, the pitying looks, and the suffocating guilt. I sat perfectly frozen in my seat. I wasn't numb. I was just overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotion I hadn't prepared for. For half a decade, I had dragged that heavy anchor of shame around with me. I hated my own biology. Now, a room full of strangers was looking at the clinical proof of my innocence in black and white text. My chest hitched. A tiny part of me wanted to break down sobbing right there at the plaintiff's table. Another part wanted to scream with laughter at the sheer madness of his cruelty. But underneath the anger and the shock, a totally different sensation finally washed over me. It was clean and light. Relief. Absolute, profound relief. Finally. The absolute truth finally existed outside my own jagged memories. Then came the final devastating blow, the paternity panel findings. The magistrate adjusted her glasses and read the official record into the court record. The lawyers traded sharp arguments. Concrete facts laid bare the timeline. When the dust finally settled, there was zero room for debate. The child was not biologically tied to Jarek. The gallery exploded into a chaotic hiss of whispers. I shot a glance over at Valia. Tears were rapidly cutting tracks through her makeup. Bizarrely, she looked just as utterly blindsided as the spectators in the back row. Ronan might have been right all along. She honestly might not have known who the father was. Jarek just sat there, completely paralyzed, like a man watching an avalanche bury his house in real time. The wildest part of it all, I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. I just felt unchained. There is a massive distinction there. Victory requires an opponent bleeding on the mat. Freedom doesn't require an opponent at all. The judge handed down the final rulings right before the lunch recess. Heavy financial restitution, mandated asset liquidation, and severe legal consequences. For the first time in years, those penalties felt like genuine accountability, not just petty revenge. As the gallery emptied out into the corridor, half of his former golfing buddies actively avoided looking at him. His carefully cultivated audience had vanished. The curtain had permanently dropped on his little performance. The truth had finally hijacked the narrative, leaving only the epilogue to sort out. Half a year after the gavel fell, I was lounging on my cedar deck with a mug of black tea when my phone vibrated. The sun was actively sinking below the harbor line, a crisp November evening, the specific kind of coastal chill that warns everyone winter is packing its bags and heading our way. I set my mug on the railing and checked the notification. It was a message from one of the junior marine biologists I managed. "Thanks for pulling me through the final grant review. I seriously couldn't have survived the panel without your backup." I actually smiled at the screen. Out of all the chaotic messages I'd waded through that year, the court updates, the invasive gossip, the morbid questions from distant relatives, notes like that one anchored me. They came from people actively building their futures, and finally, I was doing exactly the same thing. The months following the brutal court dates were shockingly peaceful. My career consumed my energy in the best way possible. By late summer, I had accepted the position of lead director for the entire deep-sea acoustics division. The promotion dragged me into grueling hours and endless bureaucratic meetings, but I genuinely thrived in the chaos. I finally woke up every single morning without hauling a backpack full of toxic resentment into the lab. That alone was the biggest win of the decade. Jarek wasn't faring quite as well. His legal nightmare kept spiraling. The initial forensic audit triggered deeper federal probes into his offshore holding companies. It wasn't a fiery, cinematic explosion. It was just the slow, miserable, suffocating weight of years of arrogant decisions finally catching up to him. I stopped reading the legal updates. Not because I was playing the saint, but because his wreckage was no longer my problem to clean up. Honestly, learning how to drop someone else's catastrophic baggage is a masterclass in survival. Valea actually reached out to me once, right at the peak of the July heatwave. My thumb hovered over the block button for a solid minute, but a weird sense of closure won out. We agreed to meet at a cramped, independent bakery near the shipyards. The vibe was excruciatingly stiff. Not outright hostile, just heavy. Time doesn't automatically scrub away massive collateral damage. She got there first, hunched over a cold brew. I walked in with my shields fully raised. For a solid 10 minutes, we just batted around hollow small talk. Traffic on the bridge, the humidity. Neither of us wanted to pull the pin on the actual grenade sitting between us. Finally, she broke the tension. "I'm incredibly sorry, Nemyra." The words didn't come out in some dramatic weeping monologue. They just fell out of her mouth, quiet and completely exhausted. I didn't offer a polite deflection, so she kept pushing through the silence. "I know an apology doesn't fix a single thing." I looked flatly at her. "No, it really doesn't." She traced the condensation on her glass. "I know, but I bought into a reality that was entirely fabricated." I watched her face closely. I didn't see any gross self-pity or desperate attempts to shift the blame. I just saw raw, ugly regret. As I get older, I deeply appreciate the gap between making excuses and actually owning your garbage. We sat there for another hour, not as old friends trying to mend a burned bridge. That dynamic was dead and buried, but as two completely different women who had survived the exact same sociopath. When we finally walked out to the parking lot, we shared a brief, rigid hug, and that was it. We drove away in opposite directions. People treat forgiveness like it's a magical light switch you just flip. It really isn't. For me, forgiveness was just a practical decision to evict the anger that was squatting in my brain. I didn't want reconciliation. I just wanted absolute, boring peace. That peace ended up being the most expensive, valuable thing I own. One rainy Sunday afternoon in late September, I was digging through plastic storage bins in my garage, hunting for winter diving gear, when I hit a heavy cardboard box. Inside was a massive physical photo album, the ancient kind people actually printed before we started outsourcing our entire lives to cloud servers. I sat right there on the cold, dusty concrete and slowly flipped the heavy pages. Grad school celebrations, chaotic field trips on research vessels, my tiny first apartment, the incredibly naive early years with Jarek. I stared at the girl smiling in those glossy prints. For the first time, I didn't feel a shred of bitterness. I didn't feel pathetic or foolish. That younger version of me wasn't weak. She was just deeply, genuinely trusting. Sometimes extending that trust pays out beautifully. Sometimes it gets violently weaponized against you. Either way, being willing to trust someone isn't the character flaw. The betrayal is. That tiny shift in perspective was like taking my first real breath of pure oxygen in years. I had spent countless nights dissecting my own behavior, desperately searching for the fatal error I must have made. The brutal, simple answer was that I couldn't have done a single thing differently. You absolutely cannot outlove someone's fundamentally broken character. People make their own choices. Jarek made his catastrophic bets. Valia made hers. Eventually, those choices engineered a fallout that completely buried them both. The same brutal rule applies to all of us, for better or worse. We all eventually have to move into the houses we build for ourselves. That evening, as the storm clouds finally broke over the harbor, I carried the heavy album back inside. My life is far from a flawless fairy tale. I still hit brutal, exhausting weeks at the Institute, and occasionally a phantom memory tries to drag me backward when I least expect it. But those ghosts absolutely do not steer the ship anymore, and that makes all the difference in the world. If walking through that fire taught me anything, it's that the truth is agonizingly slow, but it never actually stops moving forward. The universe rarely serves up justice on your preferred timeline, but reality is stubborn. It always survives the lie. If you ever find yourself staring down that wreckage, wondering how you'll survive it, just remember to look at the foundation you are pouring today. Keep building. The view from the other side is entirely worth the climb.